I love your setup, man. Look at that.
High in the Chilkat Mountains, Dustin and Wes are cleaning up the gold from the last 2 weeks.
Keep stacking it up, man. Every little bit counts.
Yeah, it does.
What if I told you a disaster could hand a miner the biggest payday of his life? At Cahoon Creek, Dustin Hurt watched a flash flood rip through his camp, snapping dredge lines, burying gear, and threatening to wipe out the entire season. But when the water receded, it left something no one expected: untouched, gold-rich ground, freshly exposed by the raging current. With winter pressing in and fuel dwindling, the crew gambled everything on this new stretch. Each cleanup tray got heavier, each dive more dangerous, until the final tally stopped just short of unbelievable: $12.6 million in gold. This isn't just a story about striking it rich. It's about how nature's fury can destroy everything you've built, and in rare moments, reveal more than you ever dreamed possible. But before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single ounce of the action coming out of Cahoon Creek this season. The ice had barely released its grip on Cahoon Creek when Dustin Hurt's convoy rumbled into the canyon, engines echoing off the sheer granite walls. Snow still clung stubbornly to the shaded slopes, dripping meltwater into the roaring stream below. The air bit at exposed skin, and the water was a weapon in itself, so cold that one slip could send a diver's body into shock in seconds. Before gold could be touched, survival came first. Crews layered up in thick neoprene, heating vests zipped tight under their suits before wading into the bone-numbing current. Their breath turned to mist in the sharp morning air as they wrestled massive dredge frames into position, the current tugging at their legs like it wanted them gone. Then, a moment worth pausing for, the first shovelful of creekbed gravel hit the pan. A swirl, a shake, and there it was, coarse, bright flakes scattered across the black sand like stars on a winter night. Even the veterans of Cahoon Creek glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. Gold like this on the very first day? That wasn't just good. That was unheard of. The news rippled through camp like a shot of adrenaline. One good pan can make an entire crew believe in the season ahead, and this was more than good. Scoops kept coming, each one spilling more color into the pans. Above them, though, the mountains wore a crown of thin, fast-moving clouds. Nobody said it out loud, but the weather had a way of turning on you here, and it was already watching. By the second week, they had it, the kind of target every miner dreams of finding. A gold-rich trench, narrow but deep, snaking beneath the creek bed like a buried vein. Every probe, every test hole screamed, "Pay dirt." The dredges roared to life, suction hoses as thick as tree trunks tearing through the gravel, drawing up pay streaks laced with visible gold. Visibility underwater was zero, a swirling brown haze that swallowed light and sound, but the divers didn't need to see. Their hands told the story. Heavier gravel, sharper edges, and that telltale weight of gold-rich material. The first real cleanup of the season was hauled into the shack. Scales blinked, numbers rising, past 200,000, past 500,000, settling just over $1.2 million worth of gold. 2 weeks in, and they were already ahead of what some crews took all year to make. Better still, the gold was unusually pure, meaning more cash in hand and less lost in refining. Dustin didn't hesitate. He doubled the shifts. If this trench kept producing, they weren't just chasing a good year. They were chasing history. And then they hit it. Bedrock. Gold is heavy, and when it moves, it sinks until it can't sink any further. At 20 feet down, the divers felt cold, smooth stone under their gloves, and that meant one thing: jackpot country. On a single dive, a full suction hose load surfaced carrying half a dozen thumb-sized nuggets, their edges worn smooth by centuries in the current. The air on the bank buzzed with shouts and laughter as the pan was lifted to the light. Gold. Not scattered flakes, not pinhead specks, but a thick, gleaming sheet across the bottom, so dense it looked unreal. The cameras caught Dustin's face, the grin that miners get when they know they've just hit something they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Talk in camp turned fearless. At this pace, they could crush every personal record, maybe even rewrite the history of Cahoon Creek. But with each dive came new hazards. Clogs in the hoses, threatening to burn out pumps, airlines snagging in shifting rock. This was no place for mistakes, because here, the creek didn't give second chances. By the time the dust from those dives settled, weeks of relentless work had turned the cleanup shack into something resembling a gold bunker. Plastic tubs lined the plywood walls in perfect rows, each one heavy enough to require 2 men to lift, packed with black sand and dense gold-rich concentrates. The air inside carried a metallic tang, a weight you could almost taste. Every time the lid of a tub was cracked, there it was, that deep yellow flash in the dim light, the silent promise of fortune. When Dustin called for the mid-season weigh-in, the crew crowded in tight, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the scale's digital display. Scoop after scoop was poured, the numbers climbing with every tray. It rolled past 1 million without slowing, past 2, then 3. At just over $4 million, the air shifted. Even the camera crew, seasoned from years of documenting big hauls, shot each other sidelong glances. They knew what they were seeing wasn't ordinary. The gold itself was a miner's dream. Finds that looked like a sprinkling of stardust, teardrop-shaped nuggets smooth from centuries in the current, bean-sized chunks that caught and held the light, and a single walnut-sized picker that clinked against the pan like a stone. Every miner knew that sound. The weight of it was music. Around the table, the jokes started. Someone quipped about calling in an armored truck for transport. Another suggested burying it in the hills and drawing treasure maps. Someone else made a mock-serious case for hiring rifle-toting guards to watch the stash. Beneath the laughter, though, ran a quiet current of awe. They were looking at the kind of seasoned miners fantasize about and rarely live. And with every new tray of gold, the idea of failure wasn't just fading, it was disappearing altogether. Then the radio crackled, cutting through the hum of voices, a sharp, urgent tone carried from a weather station upriver. A storm front was tearing toward them, loaded with enough rain to swell the river several feet in a matter of hours. The voice on the other end didn't mince words. If they were anywhere low, they needed to get high, fast. Dustin pulled the crew together, his expression caught between the weight of the warning and the lure of the pay streak. Every man there knew the stakes. Shutting down meant surrendering a day's work, a loss that in Alaska's short mining season could mean thousands of dollars gone forever. Pushing ahead meant staring down the raw power of a river in flood. The decision wasn't made in a drawn-out meeting. They'd take one more shift, but everyone would work with their eyes on the water and their ears tuned to the sky. Within 2 hours, the light was gone, swallowed by a ceiling of black cloud that seemed to drop lower with every passing minute. The first fat drops of rain splattered across the dredges, hissing as they hit warm metal. The wind picked up, scattering sheets of spray off the current. The river began to change, The clear, icy water they'd been dredging in all season turned a dull, cloudy brown. Stray twigs drifted by at first, then branches, then entire saplings. Foam collected in swirling eddies, the current tightening like a twisted rope. It was the river's first warning. The mountains above them were already spilling their load. And then, without a moment's grace, it hit. A low, rolling growl became a roar, the kind of sound that hits your chest before it reaches your ears. Around the upstream bend, a wall of brown, debris-choked water surged into view, higher than any man standing on the bank. It moved like a living thing, fast, chaotic, and unstoppable. The first dredge anchor snapped before anyone touched it, the rope parting with a violent whip. The dredge spun helplessly, caught sideways in the surge before it was yanked under and swallowed whole. The crew moved without needing to be told, dropping tools where they stood, boots splashing as they bolted for higher ground. Tree limbs the size of telephone poles slammed past, tumbling end over end in the raging current. The riverbank crumbled in places, sucking whole sections into the torrent. A fuel tank broke free from its mooring, bobbed once like a toy, and then was gone. Just another piece of wreckage in a flood that didn't care what it took. One diver was still in the water when the main surge slammed into camp. Dustin didn't hesitate. He waded into the shallows, shouting against the roar, signaling the diver to surface. When the man broke through, mask half off and eyes wide, there was no time for talk, just a shove toward the bank and a grab at his arm. Together, they scrambled upward, boots slipping in the mud, the flood snarling below them. By the time they reached the ridge above, the lower camp was gone. Where dredges had sat, where gear had been stacked, where they'd worked for weeks, all of it was now just a boiling brown ribbon of destruction. The gold-rich trench was somewhere down there, invisible beneath the chaos, and for the first time all season, nobody cared about what was under the water. When the river finally gave back the ground it had stolen, the lower camp looked like a battlefield. The neat order of gear, dredges, and staging areas had been replaced with chaos. A dense mat of branches tangled with ropes, twisted metal buried, clinging mud. The air still carried the smell of wet earth and broken vegetation, and every step sank into the soft ground with a sucking pull. Amid the wreckage, one sight stopped them cold. The gold storage bins were still there. Wedged perfectly behind a jagged outcrop of rock, they had somehow resisted the flood's fury. No chains, no straps, just luck and geology conspiring to keep their fortune in place. It was the kind of break miners don't count on, but silently pray for. The crew wasted no time. Wading through knee-deep muck, they began pulling free whatever the flood hadn't taken. Shovels scraped against buried dredge hoses. Metal detectors pinged over submerged piles of gravel, revealing lost tools. Piles of driftwood had to be hacked apart to free twisted aluminum frames. A shout from downstream brought them running. One of the dredges had been spotted, lodged sideways in a narrow channel a quarter-mile away. The current had bent its frame into a warped curve, but the engine was still intact. That meant it could run again. It wouldn't be pretty, but it could work, and in mining, working was all that mattered. No one suggested quitting. They were cold, soaked, and exhausted, but the gold they'd already pulled from Cahoon Creek wasn't something you just walk away from. This wasn't a season to salvage. This was a season to fight for. Dustin made the call. Full rebuild. Every salvage motor was stripped to its bolts, dried in the heat of propane burners, and greased under the flicker of lantern light. Bearings were cleaned with diesel, carburetors flushed, and belts inspected one by one. From the flood debris, they scavenged whatever the river had coughed up. Bent steel rebar, sections of scaffolding, even the twisted skeleton of an old bridge rail. It was ugly, but it was strong, and that was enough to fashion new dredge frames and anchor points. The damaged dredge downstream was the first to go back into position. It took hours of dragging, with hand winches, pulleys lashed to stunted spruce trees, and the combined strength of the whole crew leaning into the ropes. Mud slicked every surface, and more than once, the dredge slid back toward the water, threatening to undo all the effort in seconds. But by the end of the day, it sat back in the creek, battered but ready to work. The flood had done more than destroy. It had reshaped the river. Sections of the creek bed that had been unreachable before were now exposed, scoured clean by the torrent. Massive boulders had shifted, leaving behind deep pockets and natural traps where gold would settle. The destruction might have just handed them a gift. 7 days after the disaster, the first hoses went back into the water. The sound of gravel rattling through the sluices was more than just work resuming. It was a declaration that they weren't finished. The first test pans came up rich, not just promising, but heavy with gold. Thick, chunky pieces lay mixed in with the fines, too large to have traveled far. It was as if the flood had scooped gold from miles upstream and dumped it right into their stretch of Cahoon Creek. Divers began targeting the new pockets between boulders, the kind of formations miners dream of. Deep, still water beneath massive stones, with crevices that could hide decades of accumulation. Every scoop from those pockets was heavier than the last, the pan flashing with a color so dense it looked painted on. Then came the cleanup that stunned them all. Tray after tray piled high, the scale ticking upward without pause until it passed $2 million from a single day's work, the largest one-day total in the camp's history. No one spoke for a long moment, the number hanging in the air like a challenge to believe it was real. By evening, word was circulating through camp. Maybe the flood hadn't been their enemy. Maybe it had been the best thing that could have happened. The destruction, the risk, the loss, all of it had pushed them into ground they'd never have touched otherwise. What had looked like near disaster was now transforming into the defining advantage of the season. And with the clock ticking toward winter, the crew knew exactly what they had to do: work every daylight hour to strip this new ground clean before the ice returned to claim the creek again. The cold bit deeper with each dawn, frost layering over every surface until even the dredges seemed encased in glass. Breath hung in the air like smoke, the sound of motors slow to catch in the frigid mornings. Every gallon of fuel left in camp was precious, and the decision of where to burn it weighed heavier than the gold in their pans. 2 promising sites called to them, one tested, one unknown. The gamble fell to the flood-altered stretch, a choice that would decide whether the season closed in triumph or regret. They hit it hard. Each cleanup tray came in heavier, richer, almost mocking the weeks of struggle it had taken to get here. Jars filled faster than they could, and every night the crew fell into their bunks smelling of wet neoprene and diesel, too tired to talk, but grinning in their sleep. One morning, a diver surfaced, cradling a cobble shot through with gold veins so thick it looked painted. The rock weighed several pounds, an impossible find most miners never see in a lifetime. It passed from hand to hand like a holy relic, each man weighing it as if the truth might change the longer he held it. The days blurred into one last sprint, shifts overlapping until exhaustion was just background noise. The weather gave them no mercy. Icy wind cutting through gloves, water so cold it felt like it burned. But they pushed, knowing each hour brought them closer to the end and closer to the number they'd been chasing all year. When the dredges shut down for the last time, the cleanup shack became the season's altar. Trays lined every surface, the gold inside so bright it made the lantern light seem dull. Weigh jars thudded on the scale, the digital numbers climbing, stalling, and climbing again. 9 million, 10 million, 11 million. The digits rolled upward until they stopped at $12.6 million. The room went quiet, as if no one wanted to break the spell. A few laughs broke the silence, the kind that come when disbelief and relief collide. Others just stared, hands on hips, absorbing what months of danger, loss, and luck had built. Dustin's face carried every mile of the season. He called it the hardest he'd ever endured, and he meant it. The storms, the wrecked gear, the flood that nearly erased them. But the weight of the gold made it all real. It wasn't just survival, it was a record, a number no one in their region had touched before. The cameras drank it in, a mound of gold so large it didn't look real. The kind of sight that turns stories into legends, and the legend formed quickly. Word reached town before the season's end, passed from miner to miner over bar counters and across supply store counters. The $1 million flood, they called it, the name carrying both the destruction and the miracle it left behind. It became a reference point, a before and after moment for everyone who worked the river. Packing up camp, the crew worked slower, partly from the cold, partly from the weight of knowing the season was done. The river ran lower now, calm and quiet, the scars of the flood still carved into its banks. Gear was hauled out, dredges dismantled, and the last of the gold locked away. Dustin stood by the water's edge before they left, the promise already forming. They'd be back, no matter how high the water ran next year, no matter what it tore away. The river had tested them, and in its own violent way, rewarded them.